It is day 4,473 that Boswell has been in business, and I'm thrilled to welcome Lana Bastašić here. She is author of Catch the Rabbit. There it is, a novel I absolutely love, and we're going to chat about it. Won the European Union Prize for Literature, and you've done a whole bunch of other stuff. You've won short story prizes, I believe some playwriting too, right? Just a little. Lots of other stuff.
On the side.
Yes. Right. Lots of really cool stuff. I want to chat about it. But first, I think the best thing to get us started, maybe you could just give us like the elevator pitch for anyone who's not familiar with the book.
Yeah, so this is really hard for me. I always say this elevator pitch thing, it's so American, but I think I'm getting better at this. So yeah, this is Catch the Rabbit is a story of two women, childhood friends, who grew up in war-torn Bosnia. And years later, they haven't seen each other in 12 years, and years later, they reunite to go on a road trip together to find a missing person. So how did that go? Is that?
I think that was perfect.
Yeah, I told you I'm getting better at this.
Yeah, absolutely. If I was on an elevator with you and you were selling me this as a movie, I would buy it. If I had the money to make your movie. Yeah, I also think it's such a language-driven novel. I think the language is beautiful in it. So maybe you could read us a page or two just to give us a taste of that.
So yeah, I'm going to read from the beginning, and obviously English is not my native tongue, so please forgive any if anything sounds a bit off. This is from chapter 1. To start from the beginning, you have someone and then you don't, and that's the whole story. Except you would say you can't have a person. Or should I say she? Perhaps that's better. You'd like that, to be a she in a book. All right then. She would say you can't have a person, but she would be wrong. You can't own people for embarrassingly little. Only she likes to think of herself as the general rule for the workings of the whole cosmos. And the truth is, you can have someone, just not her. You can't have Layla unless you finish her off, put her in a nice frame, and hang her on the wall. Although, is it really still us once we stop, once we freeze for the picture? One thing I know for sure, stopping and Layla never went together well. That's why she's a blur in every single photograph. She could never stop. But I can stop, and I will. I hope that's enough.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I think there's so much going on in this book, and you capture some of it at that opening, but there's so much going on. I love how so much of the book is about who can own a person, who can't own a person. I'm really curious, what was the initial spark or that aha moment when you were like, I have an idea, this is a book? What was that idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, there were several things going on at the same time, and then at some point just kind of clicked. On one hand, I was rereading Alice in Wonderland, and I had to teach a course, and I was kind of going through the book thoroughly, and it just struck me how similar Alice's experience in Wonderland is to being a little girl in Bosnia during the war. Now, people might say that I'm, I don't know, that it was, war is one thing and children's books are something else, and you shouldn't compare those. But actually, if you think about it, Wonderland is really violent. It's really scary. It's a dark place. And it seems like there's this kind of crazy logic that Alice doesn't really understand. So that was one thing. And then on the other hand, a friend of mine called me from Bosnia, and she told me that her white rabbit had died. And we always used to joke about this rabbit, that I said, if Bosnia was Wonderland, rabbits would die. And I mean, it might not sound like a joke to you. We have a really, really dark sense of humor there. So at some point, I had all of these different elements floating around, and then I just kind of thought I could do something with this idea. And then I decided to pack it into this road trip which was also always something I wanted to do, because I think it's such a masculine genre in a way. It's always, you know, the men who are on the move and the women are kind of passive. So I wanted to take that on, and then it just kind of, you know, I saw it. There was that moment like, oh, I really see this book. So so that's kind of how it kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. I see what you're saying about the masculine genre too. I mean, here in the States, it's, you know, recently it's essentially Kerouac and all the way down. It's all the guys taking the trips. So yeah, you've definitely flipped that on its head in a really cool way, especially with the relationships and the friendships. Yeah. Alice in Wonderland too. Like the parallels are throughout the book and they're obvious. You know, and it's obviously intentional. I'm really curious. Was that a big part of your childhood, or did you come to it later? You know, because it's obviously been influential for you.
Well, I mean, as a kid, I read a lot of Yugoslav books for kids, but there were some classics like Alice, and that story was always really close to heart, because there aren't really a lot of children's books from that era where the protagonist is a girl, a little girl, and she goes on an adventure. So to me, that was something interesting. And then, of course, the Disney movie came out, and it always like kind of, I wasn't sure as a kid whether the story scared me or whether I liked it. So that was really interesting. And then once I made this kind of rereading, I was reading it as this, you know, commentary on Victorian education and times, reading it from a different point of view as an adult. Then all of those things came together, but I never abandoned that, you know, childhood reading of this magical and scary place and this little girl who is going on an adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating how you captured, you know, in your book too, this place is magical, scary, strange, but also, you know, drawing people back. Speaking of writing about women too, and writing about children, the book's been compared a lot to Elena Ferrante and those books. And I think in some interviews, you kind of push back against that some, like, even though yeah, it says it right here. So
yeah, not on the UK edition.
Okay.
I have Hammond here.
Oh, nice.
So I was kind of like, okay, can we put something else?
Yeah, totally fair. Well, I'm interested too. I mean, like, I know you've pushed back against that some, and but so what other influences are floating around in this novel, or were floating around when you were writing this novel for you?
Well, you know, I don't really run away from the Ferrante. Oh, I said that in such an English way. I would say Ferrante, but I think she's a remarkable writer. And actually, I discovered her early novels, which I even prefer to My Brilliant Friend, Days of Abandonment, and Amore Molesto is in Italian. But I just feel like maybe that comparison has more to do with, you know, the theme of female friendship. And I feel like in that way, we are compartmentalizing this topic as something strange and exotic. And, you know, we can have one book about it, where I think female relationships are so complex that we should have all these different voices telling stories about it. So, I mean, there's that, but books that were much more important to me while I was writing this novel, for example, there was Lolita, Nabokov, obviously because it's a road trip, but also because of the relationship between the narrator and the narrated, because you have this overbearing European narrator with this, you know, overly adorned language and metaphors and whatever, and kind of using this language to hide certain things, you know, sense of responsibility, crime. And then you have the other one, you know, Lolita, who's silent. We don't really hear from her. So I like this dynamics. I wanted to make this work in a similar way, unreliable narrator, all those things. And then there's also, there's a lot of Joyce, which I don't think it's that obvious, and I'm happy that it isn't. I don't want to write, you know, books for literary scholars. I want to write them for people with real lives. So But there is, I mean, there's the circular narrative. I mean, that's obviously Joyce. There's also some references to Ulysses. There's Dublin, and there's basically a whole scene which I stole from The Dead, where the narrator is looking at a woman who's listening to a song. So there are these echoes, but I hope that they're not, you know, overbearing and kind of taking away from the reading and just the pleasure of following the plot, which I think is just as important as putting all these little things down there.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I would have gotten Joyce without you saying that. So that's really cool. Although, yeah, the one character looking at another is something throughout the book that is, I think, so fascinating, the way that gaze works in the book. So you've talked about the narrator a little. Maybe we should introduce her to the audience. So would you, you know, the narrator, Sarah, there are two, for everyone, there's like two central characters in the book. But let's talk about Sarah first, the narrator. Who is she? Where'd she come from?
So Sarah, who is Sarah, but she has also been Sarah for 12 years. She is a woman from Banja Luka, Bosnia, which is my hometown in northern Bosnia. She is of Serbian ethnicity, which means that she grew up in a town where she was relatively safe. She belonged to the majority. And then after college, she moves to Dublin and kind of willingly abandons everything, not just the country, but also the language, her parents, her mother, and also the story of this very complex friendship with Layla. And I wanted Sara to be somebody who likes to aestheticize things. I don't know if I can say that in English, but like beautify things. And she's kind of, I wanted her to have this voice of somebody who uses a lot of metaphors, because she's not completely capable of looking at anything directly. She just feels more, I guess, comfortable you know, turning it into literature. And this for me was important to establish this contrast between her and her friend. And of course, the novel starts with her receiving this phone call from this childhood friend, and then everything comes back. You know, she falls down the rabbit hole of hearing her native tongue again, her name, Sarah, is suddenly, you know, Saro. It's like everything comes back to her, everything that she was repressing. And it's also, I think, a kind of a story of her education, some sort of journey for her to realize certain things and come to terms with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say too, you'll have to, she'll be Sarah with me. You'll have to deal with me butchering, pronouncing everything. I can't even pronounce English.
I think she would prefer that, you know.
At least at the beginning of the book, for sure. Yeah, and speaking of that, at the beginning, that kind of abandonment you mentioned, I'm fascinated by that starting place for her, and then how she pushes and pulls throughout the entire book. And I wonder if you talk about that a little bit, because she wants to put the past behind her. She wants to avoid it very much more than anything. And maybe without giving too much away plot-wise, can you tell us, you know, why that's so important to her, that distance from the past, that abandonment of the past?
Well, you know, this is something that I could really take from my own experience, because I was a Serbian girl living in Banja Luka, and what was happening there, just to give some context to people who might not know, that there was an ethnic cleansing going on a large scale of the Muslim Bosniak population in there. Some of them not even practicing Muslims. Most of them were even communists, but they had, you know, the wrong name, what was perceived as the wrong name. So, you know, of course, I wasn't aware of this when I was little, but it was later on that, you know, I learned things, because you couldn't even learn things, but you got one side of the story in which you're the heroes, you're the good guys, etc. And you don't hear about this, you know, this side of the story. So it was like much later on that I had this feeling of, oh my God, I was so privileged, and I wanted to incorporate this in the novel, and especially Sarah's character. This feeling of I didn't suffer because I had the right name in the right place at the right time, but somebody else had a completely different life because she didn't have these privileges that I did. So this was something, you know, and then she also feels, I think, that she could have done more, that she could have done something, because Sarah's father is chief of police, and that means, I mean, perhaps to you who are not from there, it doesn't mean a lot, but I mean, back then, those people were very much, you know, close-knit with political structures, and they knew much more than they would let on. So I think Sarah has this feeling of guilt, and it was easier for her just to leave it all behind, and that's why it was important also to abandon the language, because when you abandon your language, it's easier to abandon the memories that you have in that language. So this is, yeah, definitely something that I drew from my own experience.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about language a little bit too at some point. But yeah, I think it's fascinating too how you captured how shattering it is for her to even confront some of that privilege, to confront those, you know, stories that are perhaps not the whole truth she's told herself about that time in childhood and everything. There's a moment in the book where they visit the catacombs, and I wonder if you could talk. It's this gorgeous moment because her friend's having this is a big moment for her friend, and she's looking around at all the people, but she's also even kind of disconnecting from it in the present and from its history. She's looking there going, this is a horrible tourist trap. She's angry at it. I wonder if you can tell us, you know, the significance of that moment a little, or the significance of the catacombs to the book.
Yeah, well, you know, when you're writing a road trip, you really have to choose the places. And I had a map in front of me, and I chose the places, towns, and spots that I thought were important for not only their story, but also the story of Yugoslavia and you know, the fallout of Yugoslavia. So the catacombs are in Jajce, which was the place where the Yugoslav Republic was founded. And it's such an important place because that's where, you know, after the liberation, there was this dream was built, which was built on an anti-fascist declaration that all people are equal, no matter what their ethnicity, what their religion, etc. So I needed this town to be, especially, there's also the museum where this meeting took place, and then there's also the catacombs. I wanted it to be in the novel to kind of contrast that dream with utopia, really, with what happened afterwards. And this is this part when they go into the catacombs, they talk about one of them. Sarah says that she tied the tubes and she doesn't want to be a mother. So I wanted to kind of connect this cold Bosnian, you know, womb in a way, which was created by men, to connect it with this idea of motherhood, which is absent from the novel. This is a big deal in Bosnia and in the Balkans in general, because we are still at that point where women are seen as, you know, we're only worthy if we are mothers, if we have children. So I wanted to take that away in my book. I wanted to show them as just them, and make a comment with these catacombs on this kind of barren land after the war, you know, after all these dreams and utopias and whatever it is they built that bubble on, to kind of contrast it with this darkness. You know?
Yeah, speaking of powerful metaphors, speaking of traveling around and research, did you do research for the book, or did you take a road trip perchance at all?
Yeah, I did. I mean, once I realized what I was doing, I thought, okay, I have to I have to take this trip because, first of all, I'm not a driver. I know this must sound insane to to you guys, because I think in the States, if you don't drive, it's like you don't exist or you don't have a life. But yeah, I mean, most of my friends here, we don't drive. So my mother drives. She's an excellent driver. So I asked my mom, okay, Mom, do you want to get a car and drive to Mostar, which is quite far from my hometown, and then, you know, do this thing? And I told her I want to go there and I want to go to Yates, and I might ask you to stop along the way. And my mom was like, yeah, sure, let's go. Which is remarkable. I mean, my mom is a dentist. She's not, I mean, she reads medical textbooks and stuff. She's just not, you know, not a literary person, but she really respects my process as, you know, also serious work. And she answered all my questions about driving, about anything. You know, I would ask her, okay, Mom, hypothetically, if this happens, if somebody does this to a car, with the car, you know, flip over, what would happen with, you know, like things like that. And she was really helpful. But, you know, it was also interesting for me to take this trip with her, because she belongs to a different generation. She belongs to that Yugoslav generation of, you know, young students, you know, village. She was a village girl who got a free college education and could go to a big city and, you know, could do something. And then they would all get together and they would like clean riverbanks and build roads and stuff. So she belonged to this, you know, happy communist youth. So she saw these things with those eyes. I saw them in a different way. So this was useful because I realized, okay, I have to, you know, tell this from my point of view. I don't want to go into this nostalgia because it doesn't really belong to my generation. So yeah, I'm sorry I go on and on, but it was a really interesting trip. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
So definitely, you know, if you can, all of you listening, I think taking a road trip with your mother, it's a really interesting experience. There's also a novel there if anybody wants to write it.
Someone out there has to write that novel for us now. Yeah, I mean, speaking of differences with American culture too, happy communist childhood is not a sentence you hear very often.
Yeah.
For better, for worse, for whatever. Speaking of, I mean, I think the question we all want to know, has your mother read it? What does she think?
Yeah, definitely. She read it and she told me, well, I asked her, so what do you think? And she's like, well, of course I like it. I'm your mother. It's like, okay. But yeah, and I mean, my parents and my brother and sister and they all read it. And it was interesting to me to get their point of view, because there are some people in Banja Luka who have called me a traitor because I'm Serbian and I write about bad things that my people did, and I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to write about us, you know, as victims of something. But I was never, you know, thinking that I was writing a political book in terms of I'm going to write this book about, you know, Christians and Muslims. I was just writing about people and writing about my hometown and trying to do it responsibly. And there are some people who don't like it. But luckily, there are also other people who really connected with it and just felt that the story had to be told.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think very much you've done it in a subtle way, in a way that is very much, this is a book about people, and people live through history. People are affected by history, and you capture that incredibly well, I think. Speaking of people affected by history, we haven't talked about Layla, so maybe the same question here. Can you introduce Layla for us, and where did she come from?
So Layla is, it's hard to describe in a way. You know, all of those, you guys have a lot of these MFA programs, creative writing. We have none of that, but in those programs, I'm sure every single teacher would tell you, you really have to know your character. You have to know everything about them if you want to write them, you know, things like that. But for me, it was hard to do that because I wanted to write precisely about not knowing someone and how hard it is to know another person. So Layla was born in the same town as Sara, but she has a Muslim name, and because of that, her family suffer a lot of discrimination during the 90s, and her older brother goes missing. In order to protect her kids, the mother changes their names into Christian names, so Layla becomes Layla. And this might sound weird to you, and it is. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But back then, that was a matter of life and death, really. So this happens when Layla is 11, which means that her sense of identity is never really fixed. For the rest of her life, she's kind of trying to figure out who she is. And in this way, she's a lot like Alice, who's, you know, constantly being asked, who are you and where are you from? This also means that because she had a different life and a different experience from Sarah, she doesn't really see life as this beautiful story with a happy ending. She's perhaps a bit more cynical, more realistic, and at times cold, and can sound hurtful to the reader. But at the same time, I think she has a force of life. I wanted her to have this energy, this kind of, just like Bosnia, you know, this body that has suffered so much, and it's really unfair, but managed that she's not going to be seen as a victim. You know, she's not going to allow you to feel sorry for her. She's going to have her way, and this was important for me, even if some readers didn't like her, which broke my heart. But that's fine. She doesn't need to be likable. So yeah.
For sure. I was going to say, in defense of MFA programs, I had a mentor in one whose main character advice was give them drugs and see what happens. So, you know, anyway.
Or just give the writer drugs and see what happens. No.
The writer's asleep now.
Yeah.
No, Layla, I think a couple of things I want to ask you about. First of all, the name change. I think that's fascinating and such a powerful thing. I mean, there's so much wrapped up in the identity of the character, in their history and everything. And her brother changes his name at one point in the book too. Can you talk a little bit more about the power of that for those characters?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something that, it's not something that I invented. It's something that actually was going on in the 90s. Sorry. It was that, but I was a child back then, so I didn't really realize what was going on. So I would come to school one day and they would tell us, okay, this person from now on is called this. And you would be a kid and you would be like, what? You can't do that. What do you mean? Like, can I change my name? You know, and then your parents tell you, no, don't ask any questions. And it wasn't until years later that I realized what was actually happening. And I thought, what happens to a person when somebody just comes and changes their name like that overnight? You know, it must be really, I don't know, I can't even imagine. I don't want to pretend that I know what it's like because I didn't have to suffer that. But it was going on. A lot of people just left and moved. There were a lot of refugees. Some people went missing. Some people were never found. Some were found dead. So all of this was going on. So I always like to say, you know, it's not just an interesting plot twist. It was real. It was really happening. And I wanted to write about this. And my first idea was to write from Layla's point of view, because to me, the story of these kids was just fascinating. But then I also realized that that would be somehow appropriating an experience that I didn't have, and that I wanted to include this privilege that I talked about, the privilege of, you know, being a carefree little girl, celebrating my, you know, having my birthday parties while this was going on. So this is why I decided to do it in a different way. I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think so. We'll say so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a powerful thing too, that those two perspectives, and again, it's that voice looking at another person too, that really brings something to that that dynamic between the two characters.
Yeah, but it's also like one thing that people forget about wars. We usually think of it as, when you mention the word war, you think of a battlefield, you think of soldiers, you think of, these big things. But it starts with language, always. It starts with little things being, typed up somewhere for a newspaper. It starts with, the word Muslim being changed into terrorist, extremist, the Mujahideen or whatever, Taliban, people who are your neighbors, So it starts with that. And I think for me, it was important to show this, here, this kind of policy, or this kind of very, racist, nationalist, extreme, this kind of idea, the violence starts with Layla's name. Something is taken away from her. It's just one letter, but it changes the course of her entire life. And this is something I wanted to write about, because usually people who haven't really been through a war, haven't lived any kind of crisis of that sort, they think that wars are something that happens out there. It could never happen to us, we are safe, etc. But I wanted to show that these things, they're still happening, and they can happen anywhere. And no matter how safe you think you are, you really have to safeguard democracy and the idea of any kind of freedom, and just people being able to preserve their normal everyday lives, because it starts with these little things, like this one letter being taken out of somebody's name.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. And in the book too, the way you make that one letter change, such a violence is the right word, but it's a violence in our life. And yeah, it's powerful. Gosh, I guess I'm going to take us back to writing school, actually, a little bit here, because as a writer, thinking of Layla as a writer, I think she's the perfect character simply because she's got this magnetic pull, right? It's almost this magic power she has over Sarah, where whatever Layla says, Sarah's going to do it, right? She's going to go back to Bosnia. She's going to drive her to Vienna. And as a writer, it's kind of perfect, because you're like, I want something to happen in my book. Well, just have Layla say it. It's going to happen. So can you talk about that magic and where that magic pull that she has comes from?
Yeah, well, I'm happy you felt that way about her, because there were also people who were annoyed. but yeah, it was, definitely at some point while I was writing the book, it became an obsession for me. And for me, Layla is the central character. She's this main force driving the novel, and she wasn't just pulling Sarah and her attention. She's also pulling mine in this kind of to follow this direction, to follow her as this kind of rabbit. I just wanted her to be like, in every chapter, for the reader, both the reader and Sarah, to be almost there, to almost get her, to almost get the full picture, to almost get an idea of Layla. And then already in the next chapter to kind of twist it and change it. And to me, this was her emancipation, and her freedom comes precisely from this, this not allowing anybody to put a full stop and say, this is what you are and this is who you are. Because this is precisely what happened to her during the war, that somebody would say, you are Muslim, or you are, we don't want you here. So she's not going to allow anybody to do this, not even Sarah, who really knows her really well, or thinks that she knows her. So this is what I wanted the reader to feel also, like, what's going on with this woman? I want to, get to the bottom of this and understand it, but also kind of say, yeah, but, you don't really get to go inside people's heads. People get to have their own privacy part of their stories, which you will never know, and that's fine. And for Sarah, at some moment when she cannot figure out what Layla is thinking about, it's frustrating to her, and I hope also to the reader, not being able to get inside her head. But I just wanted there to be like, okay, this is, you got to stop here. This is where you stop, and this is where I start. It's at the same time kind of difficult to write that kind of character, but pretty early on, she just kind of developed a kind of force of her own, a life of her own. And then I was just following that force, that line, and that's what we have.
I can confirm it's frustrating as a reader that you never fully know her, but at the same time, it's really driving. You get this, like, almost you become the narrator in a way that you're also so desperately wanting to know her better, and that's impossible in a way. And it's lovely.
Well, I think you can't really know anybody. I mean, for me, it was a comment on this idea of writing something that somebody that you really know. But at the same time, it wasn't just a literary comment. It was also a comment on, can I understand what these people suffered in my hometown? Can I pretend to understand? And no, I can never understand, but I can try to be respectful, and I can use what I have to tell their story. I can be an ally in that way. Instead of appropriating, I can say, okay, I cannot understand your suffering, but I'm here and I'm listening, and I'm going to help you get out there and tell your story. So it wasn't just like a literary device. It was also a comment on that part of it.
Yeah, of course. I don't mean to speak of it just as, like a toy or whatever. But
it's also nice when somebody wants to keep reading, which right. I think, for me, it's so as a reader, and I really love reading, as much as I appreciate, good writing style, this kind of powerful literary fiction, etc. That moment of, I want to keep reading. I want to find out what's on the next page. To me, that's sacred. Mm-hmm. We tend to overlook it as something, that belongs to I don't know, pulp fiction and pop art, but actually there's something sacred about it. Like, you're messing with something in the reader's brain, there's actually a chemistry behind it. And I love that. So I'm happy you mentioned it, because that's also what I wanted to do. Yeah.
The writer doesn't need drugs after all. In that too, that unknowing and that the push-pull between the characters, I saw another parallel with Alice in Wonderland too, that kept coming up throughout the book. They're keeping these moments where Layla says to Sarah, no, your memory is shit. Your memory is terrible. You don't know what's happened. You don't remember that, right? Don't you remember this? And it reminded me so much when I was thinking about it, and then going back and thinking of those comparisons of every time Alice comes up against something that's, visibly insane in Wonderland, everyone is looking at her like, what's wrong with you? This is how things are. And I thought that parallel was really cool. And then it made me wonder, do you think either of them can really remember anything truly correctly?
Well, I mean, can any of us really? It's so interesting. This is something that I obsess over as a writer and as a person, which is, can we really remember things accurately, and how tied that is to language, the language we use to narrate these memories. Like, I had these childhood stories, and I was sure that I got them right. And I would tell them over and over, and they would turn into something else and something new. And then recently I saw some footage of certain, family celebrations and things, and it was completely different. And I think we all have this kind of experience. And it's just like this arrogance that anybody would have of saying, I know exactly how this happened, and I'm going to tell you. I don't think literature can do that anymore. You can be a witness to something, and you can give us some truth, but without the arrogance of pretending that that's the only truth there is. Just you have to take into account that you're only human, and this is just your point of view. I think that's really, really important, this kind of humility. So, I mean, now I'm kind of talking about the big picture, but in the novel, of course, it was important to me because Sarah's relationship with memory is really problematic, precisely because she cut herself away from her native tongue. So a lot of it is lost. And also just to make herself feel better and less guilty about certain things, over the years, she fabricated a lot. And there is some arrogance in her, that she does this thing that every respectable MFA teacher would tell you not to do, which is pretend to know what the other character is thinking about. There's always this kind of piece of advice, which is, oh, but this is Sarah's point of view, so we cannot know what's going on in Layla's. Yeah, but Sarah is trying, not just trying, she just pretends that she knows, she pretends that she can get there, and she can't. So this is why it was important to me to show this, not just as an unreliable narrator, which I think is, it's almost like a commonplace in writing nowadays, but somebody who knows that there are such things as unreliable narrators and can use it and play with it because she doesn't want to confront certain things.
Right, absolutely. Even the way she, we all do that, tells the stories about what the other person is thinking in order to blame them for something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. She's constantly going to be like, yeah, you would, on the first page, you would do this and you would say that. How do you know? Maybe she wouldn't,
Of course, yeah. One other big theme question, sure, why not, for the book is home. Is such a huge theme in the book, and both of them, I think, in different ways are searching for some sense of home. What is home and everything. And you've talked about this some before, but I'd love just to hear you talk about how you define home for this book.
It's such a great question, and also at the same time a difficult one, because it's hard for me personally to define a home. I was born in Zagreb, and then we moved to another country, and because of another ethnic cleansing going on in a different place, suddenly my country changed its name, my native tongue changed its name. I have 3 nationalities. It's really complex to even start. When somebody from abroad asks me, where are you from? What language do you speak? I'm like, do you have time? Let's sit down. Because there are like 20 footnotes to this story. And it would be just easier to say Yugoslavia, because it kind of takes all of it into account, but I can't say that anymore because that country no longer exists. But in any way, I wanted to incorporate this feeling of a kind of homelessness into the novel. And especially there's a chapter when the women finally reach Banja Luka, which is their hometown, where all the memories are stored. And then that place is the darkest place in the novel. And Sara is kind of confronted with this image of her mother and her home, the house where she grew up, and it's for her, it's really heartbreaking. So I wanted to incorporate this, but also to show that sometimes it's actually the people who make a home or a feeling of home. So wherever Sara and Layla drive, they could be in Vienna, they could be somewhere in Slovenia, they could be anywhere really. When they're together and they're talking about some experience that they shared and they speak that language, there is a sense of home there. And I think that's, to me, much more important than just, a pin on a map.
Absolutely. Let me say quickly to the audience that I have just a couple more questions I want to drop on Lana, but if you have questions as well, I already see a couple have popped up in the Q&A, and if anyone else wants to drop in there as well. After I ask mine, we'll go through some of those, get to as many as we can. But before you folks, let me ask. The one big thing that's been like the big news story about your book is that you translated it yourself, right? Everyone wants to ask that question. I know you've talked about it a lot, because I think it's interesting, it's unusual, it's not something that's normally done. Although you're not the only author. There's some pretty I'm sure you're aware there's some very famous, speaking of influences, Nabokov, switched from Russian to English, then started translating himself back into Russian. But I think the question I'm interested in is, as you went back and forth between the languages, and you've talked about this some, how did you think about the novel? How did you think about the characters in different languages? Because it's, we know, I mean, they even say personality changes in different languages. So I'm really curious how that changed for you.
Yeah, that was a really interesting process, because I myself, at the time while I was writing the novel, I was living in Barcelona, and I lived in a different language, and I was slowly becoming a different person, because, you express yourself in a different language. And doing this, I mean, first of all, to just give some sort of context, it wasn't something that I did because it was fun. It was hard work, and I had a day job at the time, so it was like really time consuming. But I just realized that if I want to get out there, I have to do this. Nobody's going to do this for me, because like, how many Bosnian women writers get translated into English? It's like there's a real actual firewall for us out there. So I just thought, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself. I'm going to do this. And then, as you said, going back and forth, because the novel had not been yet published in the original while I was doing this. So I could go back to my draft and, learning from the translation, I could make my, the original better, because translating is hard work. And then if I come across a sentence and I think, I don't feel like translating this thing is redundant, I would just take it out, and that was really, really useful. And especially in another language, you have this distance that you can spot certain things better, I think. To be honest, I wasn't thinking about readership in that language. I wasn't thinking, is this gonna be obvious to somebody reading this in English? Do I have to dumb this down? Do I have to explain? I didn't want to do that, because I felt like that was not fair. Later on, with my editor in English, we could, look at things that might be perhaps, some reference to a singer, a folk singer, or whatever. Like, how do we just incorporate 2 or 3 words, just so that people, reading in America know that this is a folk singer, etc. But I didn't want to do this thing of, okay, English, that's the big play field, and I have to, now do everything. Like, I don't care. This book is written in Serbo-Croatian. It has to make sense in that language. But yeah, it helped a lot. I think going back and forth, I think it made the book better than what it was before that process. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself as a writer. I could see, looking at myself as a translator, I could get angry at myself for certain things, and it was really useful. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you don't have to do it, don't do it. Yeah.
My last question is that, is there anything else you want to say about the rabbit in the title?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because in the original, we have this word for rabbit, which is zec. And zec is used both for hares and rabbits, even though actually it should be used only for a wild hare. We use it for rabbits and like bunny rabbits as well. So there's like an identity problem for rabbits in Bosnia already in the name. And I found that fascinating, you know, like these are actually two different things. And I was reading up on hares and rabbits and the differences, and it's really, there's some remarkable differences. So this was interesting, but then also, of course, I wanted to connect the Alice parallel, and also finally the painting. I don't want to spoil my own book, but there is a movement in the story from a live bunny which dies, a pet rabbit that dies, which was alive and is buried in the first chapter, towards a painted wild hare, which is immortal because it's painted, because somebody turned it into a work of art. So this is why the title was so important to me. There were some publishers for some translations that didn't like it, and would tell me, this is ambiguous, what does this mean? You know, what is this, some sort of textbook for hunters or whatever? And then I would say, no, this is really important to me because it is about catching something that's really hard to be caught, wouldn't let itself be caught, but also to make this this journey from life to art.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, totally. This has been fantastic. We've got a couple questions in the Q&A here. I'll ask you. So one person says, I'm halfway through the book, really enjoying it, and I'm finding Armin to be as intriguing as Layla, although in a different way. Can you talk about him a bit more as a character and his role in the book?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, thank you for reading and thank you for the question. So Armin is Layla's brother who goes missing. He's 16. So in the novel, he only exists in Sara's memories, and he's not really a fully formed literary character because he's remembered by a 12-year-old girl. So he's kind of this kind of 16-year-old god that Sara idealizes a lot, and she's this missing. It's also very Joycean that the central part is missing, and he's like this black hole that you can only see, you know, based on what's around it. But I wanted Sara to go from somebody thinking that the story is about Armin. She goes on this journey because of Armin. But by the end of the journey, to realize that the story is actually about Layla. It's not about a guy that you idealized when you were 12. You know, it's about this woman. So yeah, he's an important character, but at the same time, not a complete character because he can't be.
Yeah, interesting. Speaking of writers who translated themselves, now I'm getting flashes of Beckett too, for characters who are absent. But yeah, let's see, and you kind of answered that one already. So the other question is, what Bosnian or Yugoslavian writers do you admire or who have influenced your work?
There are so many, and I'm going to say some names now, and I don't know if you can write them now. But there's a great writer. Her name is Dubravka Ugrašić, and I discovered first her essays. She won major awards for her essays and her writing. She lives in Amsterdam now because in the 90s she was writing about this, Croatian nationalism and the ethnic cleansing in Croatia. And she was called a witch publicly, and she basically had to leave her own country. And now she's a professor in Amsterdam. But Dubravka Ugrašić is amazing. I love her books. There's one called The Museum of Unconditional Surrender that I would really recommend, and a book of essays called The Culture of Lies. So that one. There is another amazing Bosnian writer that has recently been translated into English. His name is Semezdin Mehmedinović. Maybe it's easier to look for his novel. It's called My Heart. And it's such a powerful story about a man who leaves Sarajevo but also about his family and his relationship with his wife, who is slowly becoming sick. So I would definitely recommend him. And I mean, I could go on and on, but
I won't stop you.
yeah, I mean, there are so many. I'm just thinking about if anybody's translated and you can read them. And that's the problem. I think that we need more, we need to talk more about translators, and we need to empower translators, and we need to pay them so that people don't have to translate themselves. And so these so-called small languages, I don't think there's such thing as a small language, but let's say small languages can actually get across, and just I feel sad for so many of my friends who can't read Serbo-Croatian, that are missing out on so much great literature because of this. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, one final question that came in, and of course it's our question too. What's next for you?
So last year I published a book of short stories in Sarajevo, Zagreb, and Belgrade, and the collection deals with childhood trauma. So all the stories are told from the point of view of a child, and that was really for me a great bridge between, you know, jumping on to next novel, just to kind of go back to the short story, which is probably my favorite thing to write, and just work, you know, and focus on working. Kind of also this kind of, somebody call it a palate cleanser, but, you know, like kind of getting rid of Sada's voice and getting rid of Catch the Rabbit, because I don't want to write the same, you know, same book all over again in the same voice. So I'm hoping, I don't know if that will come out in English at some point, but some of the stories have been translated and will appear in some magazines. So I'm happy about that. And of course, now I'm slowly starting to work on my next novel, but I cannot tell you anything about it because I'm going to jinx it. And I really believe in these superstitions. At least when it comes to writing, I believe in all of them.
Well, we won't ask anything. All I can tell you is that I think we're all just going to read whatever you write in whatever voice. We're all very excited to read it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. Lana, thank you so much. What a wonderful afternoon here. I know it's evening there, so have a great night to you. A good afternoon, night, or morning, or whatever else it might be to everyone out there watching. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.